All right. This all got started in 1979 when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford University. And I was researching Italian war crimes. And I shared a room with Claudio Segre, the son of Emilio Segre, the great scientist. He told me stories about childhood experience with Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi, Oppenheimer, all those kind of people. And I told him, made it clear that I outranked him because I was born on ground zero of mafia land in South Brooklyn. And I told him stories, personal stories about the family of Crazy Joe Gallo, Serpico the Snake, and the family of Al Capone. This was amusing, but I wanted to do something serious. So when I got back to New York, I continued my research on Italian war crimes. I was running up and down the aisles of the main reading room of the New York Public Library, and I found red books. Yeah, I was attracted to these red books. They were the index to the British Foreign Office files. And don't tell me how I did it. There was almost no information, but I picked out exactly the right files and ordered them. I borrowed the money. I always was borrowing money to pay for all of this research so that they could send me a big pile of documents on Italian war crimes, which I picked out. I don't know how that was done. I also found a book on the United Nations War Crimes Commission. And the UN War Crimes Commission book said the files of the UN War Crimes Commission were missing. Oh, that set off a brain. Right down the block from the New York Public Library was the United Nations building. So I had a brainstorm. I'm going to get all dressed up like I'm a young diplomat. Of course, I wasn't an old man like I am now. And I was going to pretend to be an aide to the Secretary General, Kurt Waldheim, without knowing. I didn't know that of the 35,000 files, there were numerous important people, including Kurt Waldheim himself. Nor did I know that Kurt Waldheim's job in World War II was as liaisons with the Italian Second Army in Italy, in Yugoslavia, and he reported on Italian war crimes. So I was going around saying I was looking for evidence on Italian war crimes, and it sounded like I was looking for German reports on Italian war crimes. It sounded like I was trying to get information on Waldheim. So I went into the UN library. I pretended to be an aide to Kurt Waldheim. They handed me the index, and the index was very useful. I called the library. They pretended they didn't have the files. They admitted they had the files, but they made it clear I could not see the register of the 35,000 names. So I went to the U.S. National Archives in Washington. And in the U.S. National Archives in Washington, I found Italian documents, which were and letters from the Italian government asking that these files be kept secret. And I found the magic document. This was a document written by a German liaisons with the Italian army, indicating all Italian war crimes, and it was signed by Lieutenant Waldheim, who I could not possibly believe was the Secretary General. There's supposed to be some guy there in another part of the U.S. National Archives who had the index, but he wasn't there that day, and I had no money for a hotel. The greatest regret of my life, one of the great regrets of my life, was that I didn't hang around all night in the bus depot until the next morning. I could have gotten it, and clearly I would have found the story of Italian war crimes would have been broken in 1979, as would the story of Kurt Waldheim. Now, what happened was I went to the UN seeking entrance to the files, and I went to the Israelis believing that they would help me get into the UN archives. And this story is just loaded with meaningful coincidences, one after another. Happened to be, I didn't speak to the ambassador Israeli ambassador to the UN. I spoke to the UN, the Israeli ambassador on legal affairs, who knew about war crimes and obviously knew that Israel was blackmailing Waldheim. And he treated me as a mafia don would be someone who's about to be executed. He told me I should not pursue any research on this subject. I went to the New York Times, however, got a beautiful half-page story on the subject, and Ambassador Rozan, the Israeli expert on war crimes, called me and told me the magic words. He browbeat me some more, and he said, we know where you are. We know where you are. What does that mean? We know where you are. We know where you are was a death threat. And this was in conjunction. I was being stalked by CIA, KGB, MI5. MI6 was covering up the Italian war criminals. They didn't want me to. Britain had covered up the Italian war crimes. They didn't want me to expose it. Mossad didn't want me to expose the fact that Israel was covering up Nazis. The KGB and the CIA, along with the Israelis, were blackmailing Waldheim. Oh my God, you don't know what it's like to have half a dozen intelligence say. The Greeks were after me. I couldn't begin to tell you. The Japanese, I couldn't begin to tell you what a nightmare it was. How I survived, I don't know. In 1986, the story of Kurt Waldheim's service in Yugoslavia, which was supposed to be secret, was broken by the World Jewish Congress without the permission of the Israeli government, and the story broke. Now, when the story broke, I managed to, Kurt Waldheim, this is in 1986. In 1987, 1986, I got a story in the London Times, Waldheim, question mark over Israel. I was indicating that Waldheim had, for a long time, even before I went to them, of course, the files of the UN War Crimes Commission in Yad Vashem in Israel, and they had been using them for blackmail. Now, of course, this story was not allowed in the New York Times. However, what New York Times published was an article by the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations at that time. Who do you think it was? It was Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently the prime minister of Israel. He wrote an article. You were afraid that the story was going to come from London and break in the United States. They didn't want any American news media to reveal that Waldheim was being covered up, was being blackmailed by the state of Israel. So he published an article that an unnamed person, that unnamed person was me, of course, was spreading these stories that Israel had the war crime files. We then have a situation where it goes through, the story gets picked up by the Italian news media, and there's some stories. Romano Giocchetti, maybe you know him of a previous generation, he wrote a story about me, which was picked up by the Italian news media. Eventually, this was picked up by BBC, and BBC, Time Watch, notified me that they were interested in making a 2-hour documentary on the subject. They sent me a contract. I signed the contract, and after I signed the contract, they said I had cheated myself because I had enough information for 6 hours of special projects, which is almost like winning. It's the equivalent of winning a Nobel Prize in history. But 2 hours was good enough. Now, the 2-hour documentary, Fascist Legacy, was an explosion in Italy. I was on the headlines for one day. And what happened is the question is, why was it such a big story in 1989 in Israel, in Italy? Number one was what had happened in 1985 when, the football catastrophe and Italians had been killed by British football hooligans. Tremendous animosity in Italy against the UK. And they saw the BBC documentary as another insult to Italy. And I was a ploy in the hands of the British. And then you had disputes between Italy and UK over the EU affairs. And then you had Solomon Rushdie. This is November 1989. Earlier in the same year, Solomon Rushdie had become the most famous person in the world because thousands of people were sending him death threats from the Muslim world that he had insulted the Prophet Muhammad in his book, Satanic Verses. And now I had insulted Italy, and I was getting thousands of death threats from veterans of the Italian army. BBC, I just read a few of them. I never knew you had so many curse words in Italian. Now, so we have Solomon Rushdie, we have the EU, we have the football, and worst of all, a few weeks before the BBC documentary, my good friend, I don't even know him, Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, sued Italy for $5 billion for reparations for Italian war crimes in Libya. I was accused of working now for Gaddafi, and I was supposed to have millions in a Swiss bank account from the good colonel of Libya. Of course, I didn't have one penny. I was living in this dilapidated room, and I didn't even, when all these reporters from Italy were calling me during my 15 hours of fame in November of 1989, 15 hours of fame, I was getting these calls. They couldn't believe I couldn't call them back because I had no deposit for the phone. I only could receive calls. That's how rich I was with all these millions. And I went on Italian television in London. They wanted me to go to Italy. I refused to go. So I was interviewed on Italian television in London. You know, Rai has an office there. And they asked me, why do you think we in Italy are making such a big thing about this Italian documentary? And I said, the problem with you Italians is you think you're the only people born without original sin. Oh my God. They said, oh my God, they're going to kill you. They're going to kill you. You're not going to get thousands. You get millions of death threats. You're insulting even the Catholic Church. So during my 15 hours of fame, it's fun to be famous, but I'd like to be famous for more than 15 hours. The Berlin Wall falls down and I lose everything. I'm back to being, how many people become world famous for 15 hours and then after the 15 hours, they're back to being penniless? Never happened to anybody in the world. So then, of course, you know what happened in Italy in 1992. You know that Rai bought the BBC documentary. It was never shown. You know, Rizzoli printed up 8,000 copies in 1992 of the book, and it was all shredded. Currently, I'm trying to get some of the books about my life published. I'm self-publishing the books here in English. I think there would be a tremendous interest in Italy. And all of these books would make a fabulous a TV documentary. You're in Bologna. Get some of these guys who make TV documentaries in Bologna. I'll send them. There's 7 subjects here. First subject, 1948 Nakba. I published a book on what happened. This explains the origin of the current problem. People are interested in all over the world. I took that 1987 book and I added 100 pages of new research. Oh my God. This book, if it was published in Italy, would be, and if you made a TV documentary about it, it would be incredible. You could also make a documentary about my book. I'm going to soon put it on as a self-published book. It would be fabulous in Italy, on Mafia Land. My family was directly involved with the gang war upon which The Godfather is based. I was involved reluctantly. They made me hold I had to hide in my little cubicle where I was living the register of all of the the police wanted to, and the other gangs wanted to find out this portfolio of all of the assets of one of the major crime families. I was holding that reluctantly. My father survived, my uncle and the guy next door who was the financial controller of one of the crime families involved in the gang war. He died and my uncle died. But it's amazing that my uncle survived. It's amazing I survived. Then we have another book on Israel's cover-up of Nazis. Oh, incredible. Of course, impossible to get published in the US. Even as a self-published book, they probably would try to stop it. And in Italy, we could break the story and make a TV documentary about that. And it's based in part on my Faber book on the Waldheim case, you see. But of course, there are hundreds of new pages of information. Then we can make a documentary on publishing, trying to publish here, self-publish, on the myth of benign Italian fascism. Well, that's the book you have there in Italy, but I've added another 100 pages of new research, and it would make a fabulous documentary. You see, only 2 hours were done by BBC. We could take that 2 hours, put it together with new information and do the 6 hours, which what should have been done in 1989. Then we have the story Too Dumb to Die. What happened to me after? What happened to me after I lost all of the millions I was supposed to get for the Italian war crime book because of the Berlin Wall? I owed so much money you can't believe. And some of the debts were passed on to mafia, and they were trying to kill me. Mafia policemen were trying to kill me, and I couldn't sleep. I was wandering around homeless in New York, and I went to the Bellevue Center where they, if you have some psychiatric difficulty, I hadn't slept. I wasn't crazy. I just hadn't slept. So I told the psychiatrist, why? He said, why can't you sleep? I said, all these mafia policemen are trying to kill me. And then he asked me the magic question, has anybody else ever tried or threatened to kill you? I said, yes, KGB, Mossad, CIA, British MI6. Now, if you tell them as an inpatient that they put me in the mental ward, it's an interesting story. Far unbelievable, absolutely true. Could only happen to me. And, it's more fabulous than incredible than any Hollywood serial comic work. And then last but not least, thank God I'm an atheist. You see, we have C.G. Jung. C.G. Jung says that of meaningful coincidences, I had so many I started life on ground zero of mafia land. I can prove that with a BBC documentary. And all of the other incredible, I've only mentioned a few incredible 1,000,000,000 to 1 chances in my life. I say these are examples of meaningful coincidences. In Italy, there has Italian scientists all over, about a dozen different Italian scientists. People in Italy don't even know this. You have some of the world's greatest breakthroughs in science being made by Italian scientists working in the UK and US. They can appear in a documentary on this subject, which verifies C.G. Jung's idea of meaningful coincidences. And we can use some of the stuff that happened, documented incidences in my life of examples of meaningful coincidence. So this, I've given you some broad outlines of some of the things that I have done in my life, and I'd be willing to answer questions. And of course, I know most of your questions will be about Italian war crimes. Thank you.